morning, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm going to start sounding like a radio commercial by reading you a few questions. Is your company innovative? Is your company disruptive? Are you agile? Do you have an appetite for risk? Are you brave? I do a lot of reading in these COVID days, and these seem to be the buzz phrases mentioned in the business community. It's, I guess, what jargon writers might describe as walking the walk. Do you, as a company, walk the walk? And I've decided that should be the theme of my talk today, because I have unique experience of having worked with a company that did all of those things and had been doing them for a very long time. I thought I'd borrow a little bit of Spanish just to spice up my communication. Anyway, this story is about a company who, for the 36 years where I was engaged with them, operated like a tiny, agile startup, even though they were an international company, not huge and global, but a mid-sized international company with a lot of quite famous brands. The company was called IDV, International Distillers and Vintners. And in 1997, they merged with Guinness UD to form Diageo, which is now the largest drinks company in the world. And what I want to talk to you about is IDV's side of the equation, what they contributed to this merger. Now, I wouldn't begin to claim that I brought this whole innovative culture to them. They were doing it for at least a decade before I'd even heard of them. In the early 1960s, they engaged in flying in the face of all the received wisdom in the Cold War to introduce a Russian vodka to the UK and to many other international markets. It was called Smirnoff. The effect of the launch was shattering, as the advertising said, and they produced some of the most exciting advertising ever seen in the drinks market, or indeed in any other category. So they brought Smirnoff to the world at a time which seemed extremely inappropriate. And if that isn't disruptive or innovative, I don't know what is. They also took on something which was almost part of the British establishment. They took on Harvey's Bristol Cream, which was a sweet cream sherry, which was the life's blood of Middle England. They introduced a brand called Croft Original, and they changed the rules. Instead of producing a rich, dark-looking liquid, they produced a pale-looking liquid. It was probably just as sweet as Bristol Cream, but IDV's take on it was pale is sophisticated, dark is not. So therefore, Croft Original is the brand for people who instinctively know when something is right. That was a memorable headline. They even used Jeeves and Wooster to do their TV commercials. And the third part of this was, in the 60s, IDV had the largest selling Scotch whiskey brand in the US. It was a pale whiskey with an Italian name called Justerini and Brooks, J&B, and it went to brand leader and sold 3 million cases in the United States market in its heyday. And this was a very tough market to crack. So IDV was a very adventurous company, and it was hugely lucky for me that I discovered them in 1969. I transformed from being an advertising man to becoming a product developer and was very excited by the prospect. And they were the first company who hired me, and they kept me on for 36 years, always as an outside consultant. It was a brilliant experience. And what I'm going to do is to take you through some of the brands that were developed during my time with them. And these are the ones that might have had global reach. We did many, many jobs on a local basis, but these are the more famous ones. And I suppose the first one, and probably the most famous one of all, is Bailey's Irish Cream. Bailey's sold 7.1 million cases in 2019. It turned over $1.7 billion, and it's the biggest selling liqueur in the world. The idea took 45 minutes. It was the only option that we produced. The company bought it without any argument, and it appeared on the market almost exactly as it was originally presented. So it was hugely successful and still is, and it's been making money since 1975. Sheridan's was commissioned by the Baileys Group 10 years after they had been established. By now they were a sophisticated marketing company in Ireland, and they wanted to develop a coffee cream liqueur. And what I loved about this idea were two things. One is I actually thought of the solution to the brief from the time I got off the aeroplane in Dublin to meet them to the time I stood up in front of them to present, which took a few minutes. And what excited me even more was the fact that the person at the client end bought the idea as it stood. And it was I made this thing up as we went along, presented it, tried to explain how it could be made, and the idea was bought and went to market, which is extraordinary. Piat d'Or was a very exciting exercise because it was, I suppose, bringing elements of typical brands just to a market as complicated and difficult for people to understand as wine. Back in the 70s, heavy drinkers of wine drank 2 bottles a month, which is quite an extraordinary figure. And they were completely mystified by particularly French wines. The Germans were making inroads into the market with some notable brands. But French wine was a complete mystery to people. And we were told to develop a French wine which would become more accessible and more easily understood than any of the French wines that had been on the market hitherto. And Piat d'Or was very simple. We produced, first of all, a bottle people could recognize. We produced a label people could remember. And we produced a name that people could pronounce. So all those things helped enormously in establishing the brand and making it accessible. And we took this further to the product. We produced a French wine product that had all the same characteristics of something like a Mars bar. It was the same every year. It was the same every bottle. There weren't these vicissitudes in quality brought about by changes in weather. And Piat d'Or, I was very proud of. It was a very successful brand. And even if the advertising line wasn't true, the French adored Le Piat d'Or. Aqua Libra and Purdy's were early attempts by the company to see whether we could sell added value non-alcoholic drinks. Perrier had taken the market by storm, selling what to us was soda water in a fancy bottle for a grossly inflated price. I think it was 70 pence a bottle. And we said, can we go a step further? Can we add things to non-alcoholic drinks which made them saleable and also gave people alternatives when issues like drink driving were looming. So Aqua Libra was an alkaline product with herbs and vitamins, which was a generally healthy, soft health drink. Purdy's was what we called a vitality drink. Aqua Libra was an iconic 80s brand and one of Princess Diana's favorites, which was a piece of endorsement we could never have hoped to have achieved. And Purdy's is still going today very successfully. Malibu was developed by IDV's South African company and sent up to London to see what we could do with it. And it was what we called a Me One. It was a copy of something that existed in another market. And the idea was to take that idea, modify it because it looked promising, and bring it to market in as many other countries as we could. IDB had a network of countries around the world where they could get products sold. And the idea behind Me One was to take success and apply it elsewhere, but not in the American market. Well, Malibu was very successful. And in 1997, when Diageo was formed, Malibu was sold to Allied Domecq for £1.44 billion. So it is a very good return on an idea that was picked up from somewhere else. Bombay Sapphire was a development of a brand that was plodding along unexcitedly in the US market called Bombay Gin, when a very charismatic and brilliant French-American called Michel Roux said, we are going to produce a super premium gin. He produced a very courageous blue bottle. Most people would have said received wisdom is don't make a product in a blue bottle. He put the ingredients that he listed, the botanicals that appeared in the gin, produced an exceptional product. And it became a huge success. And the company were desperately disappointed to have to get rid of it, along with Dewars, due to mergers and acquisitions department regulations. They had too many gins, they had too many whiskies, and they had to go. And they did for £1.65 billion that was sold to Bacardi. Smirnoff Black I put in because it was interesting, although not hugely successful. Vodka is a very strange category. You can't give it flavor, you can't give it color, you can't give it aroma. It has to be utterly neutral. So how can you come up with a new idea for vodka which compels some people to buy it? We introduced a new word to vodka, smooth. And Smirnoff Black was perceptibly smoother than any other vodka you could buy. The Singleton is now the fourth largest selling malt whiskey in the world and was based on a very simple strategy. Why develop a malt whiskey to sell to malt whiskey drinkers who accounted for 4% of the population when you could come up with a malt whiskey that you could sell to blended drinkers, which comprised the other 96? It's a much bigger opportunity. And our thinking behind it was that the journey from, say, Johnny Walker Black Label to Lagavulin was a huge step in terms of taste, and that we would produce a malt that was closer in character to the blends than the more extreme malt brands. And it worked. It was very successful. And the name The Singleton also enabled the company to sell malts from a variety of different distilleries, all under the Singleton name. It did not have to come from a single source. Ciroc was another challenge. How do you produce another vodka which is different? Well, what we did here was we produced the world's first vodka made from grapes, not from grain. So Ciroc was a grape vodka. It's based on an idea that we found in Tbilisi, in what was Soviet Georgia back in the day. And the final idea was developed at the injunction of the CEO when Bombay Sapphire left the building. He said, we need to produce another gin operating in that space because we no longer have one. And we came up with the idea of a gin that was made from fresh botanicals. It was made of fresh juniper, fresh coriander, fresh fruits. And the benefit that it offered consumers was that it had a cleaner, fresher taste than any other gin. And this has succeeded in building it into one of the major brands in the world, major premium gins in the world. So those were probably the most noteworthy, notable brands that I was engaged with during my time working for IDV. I left the company in 2005. I'm still operating. But interesting, you see how things develop. I noticed that in 2007, they invested $1 billion buying half of a brand called Kettle One, which is a Dutch vodka. And then in 2017, they spent another $1 billion, this time buying a pretty well untried tequila brand owned by George Clooney and friends. The $1 billion is an awful lot of money if you think about it. I suppose looking back on all the brands that I worked on, those brands I showed you earlier, if you took 1% of that $1 billion, which is $10 million, it would have covered the cost of the development of everything from Bailey's to Tanqueray 10, because they were developed very efficiently and very economically. We spent very little money on research. So I'm just wondering whether that same can-do attitude still exists within Diageo as did during my time at IDV. But let me now go to trying to look back and explain why I think these ideas worked, what made them work, and what made them distinctive. And the first one, I think, is that the ideas started from the top. I never once had a successful brand development that was commissioned by middle management, even as high as marketing director in a local company. It never happened like that because these people were too risk averse. I think they were too concerned with failure. And it made it very difficult. If you're worried about failure, you want all the evidence that you can possibly get to justify what you do. And the tools that we have to provide the evidence are pretty ineffectual. So I've seen people spend millions of pounds on research, taking brands to markets, and they've failed. So I think top management recognizes that you are going to fail. And their requirement, I think, is that you should make it quick and you should make it cheap. And there were cases when we did fail during my time, and we did, wherever possible, keep the operation to reasonable proportions. And another way of trying to reduce failure, I suppose, is my third point, which is if you have more than one idea, you don't have any. And this became a rod for my back, I think after Bailey's. When I would go to companies with 3 or 4 solutions to a particular brief, they would send me away and say, come back with what you genuinely believe will work, and we'll put our resource behind it. So I always produced single ideas. As soon as you start to multiply, you start to spend. And as soon as you start to spend, you start to take time. So one idea means you can work quickly, you can work cheaply, and you ought to be right most of the time. I mean, if you spend any time in a company and get to understand the way that company works and the market in which it operates, you should be right. There were very few times when we made a complete and utter mess up of an idea. And there are always ways to prevent us from spending too much on it. And I think, to me, there's an obsession with getting feedback from consumers. I feel very strongly that you should not ask consumers what they want. You should tell them what you have. You're selling things to consumers. You don't always find consumers who are in the right place at the right time. The Baileys people said it was a girl's drink and they didn't want to be seen drinking it. That was the men. Women said it reminded them of a diarrhea remedy. We took the research report, put it in a briefcase and gave it to the company at the 10th anniversary party. And fortunately for us, we were right. People spent far too much money on research, on testing ideas or testing alternatives. I'm always amazed at, say, a company spending $100,000 on a design and then going and asking a whole lot of people who know absolutely nothing about design which iteration they like best. It's crazy. Another point about ideas, when you present ideas, you often present them to groups of people. These are highly intelligent, highly skilled people, experienced in the business. But when you present ideas to people, everybody feels they need to make some contribution. And you know the old saying, camel is a horse designed by a committee. Well, the bigger the input, the more pronounced the humps on the camel. You have to have one person who buys an idea in the same way that you probably have to have one idea from one person who sells it. And I think when you break with that small two-part relationship, you run into trouble. The ideas it's not a democracy in the same way as you don't democratically invite consumers in to change what you have. One of the things I'm grateful about in my background, working for companies like Procter & Gamble and Unilever, is they kept me honest. They said, you're selling product. You aren't going on some kind of intellectual quest to change the world. Excuse me. And they taught me that you should look to make products functionally better. Many, many years ago, I worked for Richard Branson on a project to introduce virgin lager. He'd had failures with virgin vodka and virgin cola. And when I said to him, what do you feel about the product? He said, as long as it matches Budweiser, I'm happy. And that was a mistake, because I think that Virgin had such a great reputation for innovation that they should really have tried to change the rules, introduce a different vodka, a different cola, and a different lager. They didn't, so fortunately the project failed. Functional superiority is something we should always aim for, a better product. And finally, just for those of you who are organizing for brand development, product development within your company, I worked in teams for most of my life because you can't do everything. I can't draw and I know nothing about chemistry. But I found the best teams were where people's skills were opposite. When I worked with people whose skills were similar to mine, we always argued, nothing ever happened. But if I worked with an open-minded chemist, I would be admiring of what he could do because I couldn't do it. And he likewise would be admiring of what I could do because he wasn't so good. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is my story. Thank you very much for listening. Oh, and one more thing in Columbo form. I've written a book about my experiences, which you'll see on the slide here. Its title is a bit outrageous. It's called That Shit Will Never Sell. And it comes from the origins of Bailey's. The CEO of IDV took a bottle of Bailey's to New York to our man in America, who was a titan in the industry, showed him the product, poured him a glass, and looked at him expectantly, waiting for a comment. He turned to him and said, "That shit will never sell." I'll give him his due. He actually did make a very good job of selling it in the US market. But thank you again very much.